Rotary cutters first started being used for patchwork in the late 1970s. They revolutionised patchwork and meant sewing machines could be used to make quilts a lot quicker. You can cut an accurate size shape of fabric, and it's more accurate than cutting with scissors. In theory, if you cut an accurate size shape and sew it with an accurate seam allowance, your pieces should fit together like a puzzle, fingers crossed. This is a set used, and it consists of 3 items. It's an investment if you are serious about making quilts. You can buy beginner sets for about £35 plus in the UK and $40 plus in the United States. So I have here a self-healing mat. I like to use a big A2 size one. This is actually a very generous A1 size one. This is because when fabric's cut off the bolt, you can cut the entire piece because you get the width of the fabric on it. I also like my A3 one because I can use this when I'm working on smaller pieces. A tip for using mats is to store them flat so they don't warp. The next piece of equipment is your acrylic ruler, and again, like the mats, they come in a wide variety of sizes. To start, I suggest buying a long ruler, and they're usually about 6 or 6.5 inches by 24 or 24.5 inches. As with the mat, this is because you can cut across the width of the fabric without having to move it. Other sizes I quite like are the 6.5 inch square, which is really handy, and the 12.5 inch square, which is good for larger units. And as with most quilters, I've accumulated different sizes over the years. I sew using inches, as do most quilters, and buy a ruler that's got the inches markings. However, they're also available in metric from specialist quilt retailers. You can buy grips for your ruler if you feel it moving around. Here's a pack of them here, and you can see I've got them on the back of my ruler. And occasionally you can buy rulers that already have the grips on them, and these make them easier to use. So the third piece of your set are rotary cutters, and I've got some here. They're usually available in 3 sizes, a 28mm, a 45, which is what these are, and a 60mm, which is what this large one is. The standard size the majority of people use is a 45mm. There are 2 common types. There's a standard one where you release the blade guard, cut, and then you cover it at the end. And there's another one that you squeeze as you cut, and that releases the blade. You can buy new blades for your cutter, and you'll get to know how old your blade is, because when you start cutting the fabric, you'll notice it's not being cut as efficiently, and that's the time that you need to change it. At this stage, I give a warning about rotary cutters. You must take care. They're a circular blade and a very sharp one. Treat it properly and you'll have no problems, but there are some tips I have for you. Always cut away from you, and always keep the blade covered unless you're cutting. If you leave the blade out, for example like this, and go away, you can end up cutting yourself. For example, if I was to do that, leave it on my work table and then go and answer the phone, then come back, I could pat the table to find it and I could cut my hand. I've heard of some thankfully minor injuries over the years, but they could have been worse. For example, one quilter had the blade out and without realising pushed her fringe back. She had a small cut on her cheek, but she dreaded to think how bad it could have been. With the standard one, always cover the blade when you finish sewing, and with the one you squeeze, you never need to lock the blade out. There's no need. As you cut, you squeeze and then release. We don't put fingers near the end of our rulers because we need our digits for sewing. And finally, the obvious one, keep them out of the way of children. I use one of these at home as it has this lock on it, so when it's locked, it doesn't open. So it means if my children rummage in my sewing box for anything, they cannot accidentally push the handle in. This is how it works. It's locked, move the red bit over, and then I can squeeze as I cut and then lock it. So how to cut squares from a fat quarter. So I've pressed my fabric and I've laid it down on my mat. I've put my ruler down, and then I'm just going to trim a small amount off this side to give me a straight line. Now turn the fabric round. I'm going to cut 4-inch squares, so I need to use my 4-inch marking, which is here on my ruler. So I've lined up the 4-inch with that line I've just cut. There we go. And I've now got a 4-inch strip. You'll notice as I cut, I was moving my hands up. And again, always be in charge of your ruler. If you feel it slipping, just stop cutting, move your hand as you cut. So I now turn the fabric round and I'm now going to trim this edge off here. I've got it lined up at the top and the bottom. Here we go. I'm now going to turn the fabric round. So this is all lovely straight and square. So now to get my squares from it, I'm just lining up the 4-inch marking here, and I'm making sure it's straight at the top and bottom. I'm just going to cut. So we have one square. Another square. And like so. And you keep repeating this down the strip till you've got all your squares. To cut 2 layers of fabric, we do things slightly differently. From this fabric here, I'm going to cut a long 2.5-inch strip. So first lay the fabric on the board, and I'm just going to straighten that first edge. And now where we've cut that, that's sealed the layers together. So if we were to pick it up, we would never get them laid back down so they're nice and lined up and exactly straight. So the way I get round that is I'm going to spin my board, and I'm now going to cut my 2.5-inch strip. I've got it lined up there. And here we've got my strip. And I could keep cutting these strips all the way along the fabric if I wanted to and needed them for my project. Appliqué is a technique thought to be older even than patchwork. It's a lovely creative way of decorating fabric and quilts. It is essentially a piece of fabric applied on top of another fabric. As with all quilt making methods, there are literally hundreds of different ways of doing it. The easiest technique is fusible appliqué, where a shape of fabric is literally glued onto a piece of backing fabric, and this is what I'm going to show you now. I have a square of backing fabric here, and I want to apply a heart in this pink fabric on top. I have some of this which is called fusible web. It's like those Wonder Web reels you can buy to turn up trousers and skirts, but it's bigger and it has a paper backing on the back. My heart shape is about 4 inches, so I've cut my piece of fusible web to 4 3/4 inches and my pink fabric to 5 inches. You next place the fabric on the ironing board and you place your Wonder Web on top, rough side down. It's the rough side that's got the glue and the smooth side is the paper. And we've cut it slightly smaller than the piece of fabric we're going to glue it onto because we don't want it to end up on our ironing board or on our iron, and it's a nightmare and you have to clean it off. So I'm just placing it glue side down and I'm just going to press, and you'll notice I'm using an up and down motion, not going from side to side because this can distort it. So this is our piece of fabric. It's quite hot at this stage, so we just give it a minute or two to cool down. So now it's cool, we place the template on the back and we draw around it using a pencil. Remember, you can draw any shape you like, and if you're not sure about what to do, quite often a good idea is to get some Play-Doh templates, you know, the cutters, and then you can do things like dogs and cats. So I'm just going to cut along the line. There we go. Voila, we have our shape. Quick note here, if you are thinking about doing something such as lettering, because it can be really lovely doing names or initials, is you have to reverse the image, otherwise it'll end up the wrong way round. So next I'm going to peel this paper backing off. You need nails for this. There we go. And can you see there, you can see some of the adhesive on the back. So I'm now going to place it in the centre of my backing fabric. To help me line it up, I'm just going to fold this in half and finger press the middle. And now that line means I can line up the point of the heart, and that will end up in the centre. So I take it to my ironing board, and using, just remember that up and down method, just heat it up so that it glues the backing fabric. There we go, and then we have our shape. Now this technique doesn't have the edges turned under, so you do have a raw edge. It's best to do some kind of stitching over the edge to stop it from fraying. If you're sewing by hand, you can whip stitch over the edge like this. And this is just 2 pieces of normal sewing thread, just taken over the edge. Alternatively, you can do blanket stitch, which I've done around the petals here, and you can see it nicely around the centre. Or you can even do decorative stitches, such as these little crosses I've put around the edge of this cushion here. If sewing on the machine, you can use a zigzag stitch like I have done on these circles here, or you can use a blanket stitch like I've done here. Both of these have been sewn through the layers when I stitch around the appliqué, so it's also quilted the work at the same time as protecting the edges, and this is a really nifty shortcut if you're doing some appliqué on the sewing machine. This box has been inspired by the traditional technique of Rotary purse. This name is given to a technique where motifs are cut from one fabric and then sewn onto another piece. It was widely used from the late 18th century into the 19th century when chintz fabric was expensive and so highly prized. My modern take on the technique uses fusible web to attach the motif to a backing fabric, and then the edge is sewn using a blanket stitch. Most sewing machines have this stitch, however if yours doesn't, you can use a zigzag stitch like I have done here, or if you fancy doing some hand sewing, then use a blanket stitch, whip stitch or crosses around the edge of the motif as shown in the previous video. My finished sample here is for a kitchen, but I've themed the one I'm making today to go in my son's bedroom with a music theme, so I've got headphones and cassettes. The whole point of Rotary purse is looking for a motif in the fabric to cut out and apply to another piece of fabric, so do have fun when you're looking at fabrics. The motifs on this box have been stitched after the fabric has been basted, which means it also quilts at the same time. You can also use this technique to make a larger quilt, and you apply the motifs in this way, where you layer the quilt, and then when you stitch through, it quilts it after. So I have here my fabric with motifs, and I've got a fat quarter of fabric for the front. I've also got a fat quarter of wadding, and I've got a strip of binding fabric, and this is 2¼ inches by 44 inches, just to strip off the bolt. My lining fabric is here. You can use a fat quarter of calico for backing the box. I'm using just a plain cream. This goes inside the box underneath the lining, so it isn't seen. So buy something cheap from a sale bin or use calico. I've also got a sheet of fusible web, and I've got 8 small buttons to sew on at the end. These are optional, so leave them out if you don't like them, or use them if you do. I've chosen 100% cotton thread in a colour that I think will look good next to the motifs and really make them pop and stand out. And then finally, I've got another reel of thread that tones with my binding, and I'll be using this to sew the box together as well. From my sewing box, I've got sharps needle, quilter safety pins, I've got scissors, and I've got a fabric marking pen, and I'm using a chalk one. My sewing machine is ready to go. I have my walking foot handy, and I've set it up with my clear zigzag foot. If you don't have a walking foot at this stage, just use a 1/4 inch foot, but do be careful as you sew because we're going to be stitching lots of layers and we don't want them to pull. I will also be using an iron later on. So the first thing to do is to make your templates. Cut an 18-inch square out of card, and then a smaller 5 6/8 square of card. And then you place the smaller square in the corner of the larger square and draw around it with a pencil. Once you've done this, get a pair of scissors and you just cut this shape out in the corners here. You then take your box fabric, the fabric that's going to be seen on the front, and your lining fabric, and then you draw around this and cut out using scissors, follow the line. put the lining one to one side, and here is the piece of fabric I have for my box. The next thing to do is to prepare your applique motifs. So I'm using these two fabrics here, and I've had a look through and identified some motifs that I want to put on my box. When you've chosen your motif, cut it from the fabric and add about 1/2 inch extra all the way around the edge. I then cut my fusible web smaller than the piece, because if it's bigger, we're going to get it stuck on the ironing board or to your iron, which is a real nightmare. Then iron it to the back of your motif, like this. And you'll see it's very roughly cut because I'm going to trim it down after. And then get some scissors and then cut round the edge. You can either cut right on the edge of your shape, or you can leave a little border if you don't want the stitches to go right into the motif. There we go, I'm happy with that now. And then once you've got all your motifs, peel the fusible webbing off the back. Like that. And then we want to place them on the box. Remember, when you place them, the box is going to lay upwards. So we want them facing in like this, so that when we assemble it, they're all going to be the correct way. Also, make sure you don't put them too near the edge, because otherwise they get lost in the seam allowance. When they're positioned correctly, press them with an iron to fix them into place. And then the final thing we're going to do is we're going to get a chalk pen, and we're just going to draw a line around the bottom of your base, just to make a square. Now I'm just going to take this to the ironing board and attach my motifs. Final stage, once you've pressed your shapes on, is to baste your box to assemble it as the layers. And I'm just going to use quilter safety pins, and I'm just going to fix them through the layers in a grid format, as I would if I was making a quilt. When I put the pins through, I'm going to be careful not to put any round the edge of the motifs, because I'm going to be stitching round them in a minute. So after you've drawn the lines, stitch along, following them at the bottom, and this helps square up the base of the box for later. The next thing to do is to set up your sewing machine for blanket stitch. Use your machine manual for guidance, and do test your stitches on a scrap piece of fabric to make sure you're happy with the width and length. The next stage is to place your fabric under the presser foot, lower the presser foot, and then you start stitching. And ideally what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the line just off the fabric there, and then these lines of stitches go into the fabric and take a bite of it. And every so often, stop with your needle down through the fabric and raise the presser foot, and just make sure it's not pulling or distorting at all. So when I get back to the place where I started, with the thread on the front, I'm just going to thread a needle and take that through to the back. And I'm just going to tie them in a reef knot, left over right and right over left. And then I'm just going to trim it like this. And then that's just going to secure the threads, and that's going to be hidden inside of the box. Once all the motifs are stitched on and you've tied your threads off at the back, you then cut your wadding and your backing level with the front of the box. You remove all your quilter safety pins and you just cut round with scissors. Might be a good time to mention that I use quilter safety pins, not normal pins, even for small projects when I'm layering them, because it can act as a bit of a hedgehog. So when you try and touch your work, particularly if you try and roll it up and put it in the machine, they'll be a bit spiky. So don't be tempted to use normal pins you just put through. Do use the safety pins. So we are now going to sew the sides of the box and make it into a 3D object. For this I'm using a walking foot, as there's lots of layers. I'll be talking more about a walking foot at the next session, but do bear in mind the correct way to fit one is to make sure the lever here is on top of the needle screw and you've screwed it in securely. So I'm going to fold my box over so it looks like this, and I'm going to place a few pins through the layers. Now I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what I've done is I've moved my needle over using the zigzag function. Although I'm using a straight stitch, that moves the position of your needle. And I've practiced a few times on some scraps of fabric and then measured the seam allowance, just as if we were doing a 1/4 inch seam from a normal kind of sewing foot. So it's now all pinned, and I'm going to put it under the presser foot and just sew all the way up to the top. And then I'm going to repeat this on each side. If you're a bit unsure about the seam allowance, you can be slightly generous. Because we're not lining this up as if it's patchwork, it just means your box will end up a little bit smaller. So when your box looks like this, we just got to turn it inside out and then carefully use your fingers just to push the edges out like this. And then place your lining inside the box and position the seams of the lining level with the seams of your box, and then put lots of pins round like this to hold it into place. Now we want to sew round the edge as close as we can to the edge. We want no more than about 1/4 inch because that's our seam allowance for our binding we're going to put on after. Now to make it easier, I'm going to use my free arm on my sewing machine, and that means I can place this under easily and just spin it round as I sew. There we go. And it now looks like that. And we're just going to put some binding around the top to finish it. The box is bound using the double fold binding technique. We're sewing it round the top of the box as if it's a tube, so we will cover the technique of corners, which we mitre at the next session. To make your binding, take your strip of fabric and iron it in half widthways. At one end, you want to fold in about 1/2 inch-ish, you just want it straight, and press it. And here's my binding in this strip, all nice and pressed. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pin it to the outside of the box like this, with the raw edge of the binding level with the edge of the box like this. So I've sewn my binding on, and I've used a walking foot and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've now got to the end. This is where I started, and I left a couple of inches gap there so I could just tuck in this last bit here. This will end up longer than you need, so just get a pair of scissors and trim it. So you just tuck that in, get it looking nice and neat, place a pin in it, and then you just carry on sewing to trap that in. And then the next thing we're going to do is take it over and hand sew the binding. So once you've finished machine sewing your binding, it should look like this. And the next stage is to hand sew your binding to the back. Now we're going to go through the wadding and the backing fabric and our lining, but we're not going to go through to the front. And we're just going to use the slip stitch with a toning thread. Once you've done that, trim any stray threads on it, and then it's suitable for you to start using it. On my sample here, I've sewn buttons on at the corners, which I think looks quite nice, and it helps it keeps this nice boxy shape. So do have some fun with this box and look out for some fabrics with some brilliant motifs. You can personalise it for who or where you're making it for.